So don't let the elegant and dainty lines of this bike deceive you. This bike is a ripper. Today, I'm going to review the Buena Vista by SOMA Fabrications, find out what I like and dislike about it in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling, riding, party pace, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. One of my goals for this year was to focus on unlikely, maybe forgotten, yet really cool bikes, and I think this bike definitely fits the bill. This frame shape is known as a mixed style bicycle frame. Not mixedy, although this one article by Momentum magazine does say that the English pronunciation is indeed mixedy. Couldn't find anything definitive, so mixedy or mixed, say it how you will as long as you're understood. What defines a mixed style frame is that it has a sloping top tube, and instead of one long tube, it's split up into more slender tubes that then bisect the seat tube. The supposed advantages of this design are that one, it gives you a lot more standover rather than a traditional diamond frame. However, it still gives you the same lateral stiffness because of its kind of bridge-like trusses without adding a ton of weight. Plus, it just looks dang cool. If you're a lover of bikes, bike history, and bike design, you've got to appreciate the mix. That's all I'm saying. So let's start off with the frame. It is a steel frame and fork. The fork has some nice looking biplane lugs, very slight gentle curve, and some eyelets to mount a rack and fenders you could put on lowriders, or in this case, I have mounted the SOMA Demi-Porteur rack. This particular build is 650B, running some of my favorite tires, the SOMA Casdero in 650B by 50. The rims are by Velocity. I believe they are the Dyad. So they are clincher only, not tubeless. And it is indeed disc brakes. In this case, it is using the SRAM level hydraulic disc brakes. One thing you'll notice is that the bike is quick release, and I know this is going to be a deal breaker for some, but in my experience with this bike and other disc brake bikes with quick release, it's not that big of a deal, guys. Granted, you do have to take some care when replacing your front or rear wheel so that the rotor is centered, but with a little practice, you get the hang of it, and you'll survive. Trust me. Moving to the controls, it's got a SOMA stem. The length here is 120 and the handlebars are the SOMA Osprey. I really dig the Osprey bars. I actually have these bars too on my Polyvalent. Very similar in sweep and hand position to the Jones bar, minus the big loop. So that cuts down on weight and makes it more city or mountain bikey looking. The grips are some ESI silicone grips, which I absolutely dig. See my previous video, I talked about the grips a little bit. Looking at the controls, this is where things get interesting. It is using SRAM level hydraulic brake levers, and the shifters on this bike are by S-Ride, and it is a 2x. For you younger kids out there, that is basically two 1xs run at the same time. Amazing. What will they think of next? You probably haven't heard of S-Ride, but I think with the component shortage, you may be seeing more S-Ride parts out there as people struggle to get Shimano parts. And I have to say, they may not look the fanciest, but they work pretty dang well. Shifting is operated with a pair of thumb levers, so it is push-push. Looking at the drivetrain, the crankset is a 2x. It's running the SOMA IRD Defiant 4630 chain rings, and the front derailleur is a SRAM 2xXO front derailleur. I don't know if that front derailleur was necessarily designed to shift a 4630, but it works really, really well. In the rear is a 10-speed cassette. I believe it's an 11 to 36, and the rear derailleur is an S-Ride M400. So the M400 derailleur works both with 10 and 11 speed and operates with a similar pull as Shimano mountain bike Dior rear derailleurs. The bike has rear sliding dropouts, so if you want to, you could run it as a single speed or use an IGH hub. There's also eyelets on the rear of the bike, so you can also put a rear rack. So lots of functionality, lots of options to build this bike up in different ways. To top the bike off is a SOMA seat post. I don't know which one specifically, and the saddle is a Ergon saddle. Again, my go-to synthetic saddle for most of my personal bikes, and I have a couple spares to put them on these review bikes. So that's it for the components and specs and boring stuff. How does the bike ride? I don't know about you, but when I see bikes generally with a swept-back bar, I assume that they ride a little pokey. Let's just use the word pokey. Kind of dawdly, meandering, not in a rush to get anywhere particularly fast. And that's what I assumed as well, but after riding it, this bike is full of surprises. For me, it handles a lot quicker than I thought and also steers a lot more responsive than I thought. SOMA describes the geometry as sport touring, so not quite long haul trucker territory, not quite, racy road bike. So kind of in between, maybe something like gravel bike geometry, if you will. In the front, it's got a 71.5 head tube angle with a 45mm rake. With this particular tire, the resultant trail is 68. So kind of there in the upper end of endurance road. A lot more nimble in handling than the Marin Larkspur I reviewed. And it's actually par to my Crest Bambora in terms of the trail number. How this relates to on the road is that the front end is pretty light and responsive. Part of this is due to the trail, but also in large part to the handlebars, which kind of sweep back. They put my hands pretty near the steering axis of the bike, so it takes really light movements to avoid obstacles or just to turn into corners. Super fun and responsive in the front. On the rear of the bike, the chainstay length is 430, so again, in that sweet spot, all-rounder category. Interestingly, the C-tube angle on this bike is 74.5, so definitely on the steeper side of things. And for me, I actually prefer a steeper C-tube angle. Maybe it's because I'm short, but I just like how it climbs. I feel like I can get more of my weight directly over the bottom bracket and just, you know, put whatever measly watts I have into the bike. And it feels better. I don't know if it's faster doing a seated climb. On flat, paved, and gravel terrain, the bike rode fine. Because of the wider bars, it was pretty easy to keep it controlled, even when crossing over the grassy middle of some gravel 2-track. One thing I really like about this setup are the handlebars. When things got windy or on a really steep climb and I wanted to engage different muscles and lean forward, those front loops of the handlebars were a really good platform to hold on to. In terms of climbing, this is where the bike was a really big surprise. It climbs really dang well. I know I didn't mention the weight. I think the bike, as you see it on our scales with the front rack, comes in at about 28 pounds. I know that sounds heavy, but it's a light 28 pounds, if you know what I mean. Standing on the bike with those handlebars really puts your weight over the bottom bracket, and you can get a lot of energy and power going uphill doing standing climb. Interestingly, it also did really well as a seated climber. Again, I use that forward loop position, so it gave me a position that was very similar to being on the hoods, if not a little bit narrower. But all that to say, this bike is no slouch. Going down gravel descents, the bike was an absolute blast. Although it's not a very high trail bike, because of the wide handlebars, it gives you a lot of leverage and control. So I could take things pretty quickly on this bike where I would probably go a little bit slower if I were just on drop. There's definitely a lot of compliance in the bike. I don't know if that's necessarily from the mixed design. There's part of me suspects a lot of it is from the handlebars. The Ospreys are just really wide and you can get them to flex if you stand on them. So I think that's where I was getting a lot of this feeling of compliance. Also the tires, maybe the frame, maybe the fork, but made for a pretty plush ride and wasn't bone jarring. Another interesting observation I made was that I could ride this bike pretty well no-handed. And this is significant insofar as with the Marin Larkspur, which is a step-through design but not a mixed design, I found it hard to keep it going straight when riding no-handed. I attributed that to the high wheel flop and also because maybe the sloping single top tube wasn't very laterally stiff. But on this bike, there was no tendency to wander when riding no-handed. So there you have it, laterally stiff and vertically compliant. Probably not what you were expecting for this bike. Okay, so what are the pros and cons? The big pro, one big pro is that it's a beautiful looking bike. I love this teal color. I love the mixed design. It's very elegant, but the bike isn't only good looks. There's a lot of functionality. You can put a front rack, a rear rack, no racks. You can go rackless packing, bike packing, I think that's what the kids call it. And that makes this bike super versatile. You could use it as a commuter. I also wouldn't hesitate taking this bike touring. I think it's completely capable of doing that. Another big plus is how it rides. It's really fun, it's nimble, it's a lot faster than it looks. It would be an absolute hoot to take this bike and ride it at a gravel event. I think it would do it really well with style and grace and also turn some heads. Another thing I like about this particular build is that it's a really interesting build. It's kind of a mishmash of parts, but they all work really well together. The Defiant crank, it looks good, it shifts well in my experience. Same thing with the S-Ride components. I know they look a little janky, you may be wondering, can you trust this brand? But in the couple of months that I've been riding this bike, the shifting has been spot on. Probably not as quick as the higher end Shimano, maybe a little bit more pressure needed in the paddles, but it gets the gears in gear. So I think for most people, the S-Ride components and the IRD crank would serve you pretty well. So those are all the pros. What are the cons? One big functional con, I think, is the lack of water bottle cages. It's got one on the down tube and none on the C tube. So you definitely have to figure out where to put water bottles. Another con is because of its strange shape, chances are you're not gonna be able to find a frame bag that fits it if that's what you wanna do. Although there is a lot of room here, you can make some goofy top tube frame bag. It's just begging for creativity. Also, the frame shape, I know it's gonna just turn some people off, but if you can get over that, this is a super fun bike, super unique, not something you see every day. I dig it. I really, really like this bike. I asked to review it just to see if it could ride gravel. Maybe I could make a funny video about it. But as I've ridden it, I've actually just come to appreciate it as a good bike, a fun bike. So if you want something that can ride the grav, that you can take touring, that you can take commuting with style, that isn't like every other carbon copy gravel bike out there on the market, it's going to turn some heads, especially if you're a dude. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. Then check out the SOMA Buena Vista. If you guys have any questions, leave those in the comments below. If you like this review, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or buying stickers or some artwork. This channel is 100% supported by viewers, but mostly I'm just a sticker salesman. So until next time, everybody, keep the supple side down.